Artillery exchanges pounded war-scarred cities in eastern Ukraine on Friday despite Russian leader Vladimir Putin unilaterally ordering his forces to pause attacks for 36 hours for the Orthodox Christmas. The brief ceasefire declared by Putin earlier this week was supposed to begin at 9 o'clock GMT Friday and would have been the first full pause since Moscow's invasion in February 2022. But AFP journalists heard both outgoing and incoming shelling in the frontline city of Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine after the time when the Russian ceasefire was supposed to have begun. Putin's order to stop fighting during the Orthodox Christmas came after Moscow suffered its worst reported loss of life yet, and was followed by a U.S. announcement of more than $3 billion in military aid for Kyiv, its largest single assistance package of the war. Kyrylo Tymoshenko from the Ukraine president's office earlier said that Moscow's forces had struck a fire station in southern city of Kherson in an attack that left several people dead or wounded. The head of Ukraine's Lugansk region meanwhile added that Russian forces had fired 14 times on Kyiv's position and attempted to storm a settlement held by Ukrainian forces. Ukraine had already dismissed the halt due to last until the end of Saturday, 21 o'clock GMT, as a strategy by Russia to gain time to regroup its forces and bolster its defenses following a series of battlefield reversals. The U.S. State Department said the Russian strikes proved the ceasefire was a cynical ploy, while the French Foreign Ministry described it as a crude attempt by Moscow to divert attention from its culpability for the war. Since the invasion began on February 24 last year, Russia has occupied parts of eastern and southern Ukraine, but Kyiv has reclaimed swathes of its territory and this week claimed a New Year's strike that killed scores of Moscow's troops. In Bakhmut, located in the Donetsk region, dozens of civilians gathered at a building used as a base for dispersing humanitarian aid, where volunteers organized a Christmas Eve celebration less than an hour after the ceasefire was to go into effect, handing out mandarins, apples and cookies. Pavlo Dyachenko, a police officer in Bakhmut, said he doubted the ceasefire would mean much to the city's civilians even if it had been respected. Far from the front line, Moscow resident Tatyana Zakharova said she was not in a festive mood on the eve of Orthodox Christmas because her brother was fighting in Ukraine. The United States on Friday announced a more than $3 billion aid package for Ukraine that includes 50 Bradleys and dozens of other armored vehicles, as well as artillery pieces and ammunition. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky hailed the new package as timely and strong. It brings total U.S. military assistance since Russia invaded in February 2022 to more than $24.2 billion. Both Washington and Berlin had pledged to provide infantry fighting vehicles for Ukraine the previous day, with Germany saying Friday it would deliver about 40 Marder vehicles within weeks. The proposed truce is a significant moment for this long and brutal battle, although it's worth noting that there have already been reports of shelling in the city of Bakhmut. Moscow suggested the ceasefire would allow Russia's Orthodox Church to observe Christmas on January 7, and any fellow followers in Ukraine. The head of the Russian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Kirill, has been a keen supporter of the war, previously stating that military duty washes away all sins, but called for a Christmas truce shortly before Putin. However, the idea that Ukraine would be willing to halt the war effort temporarily in favor of a religious holiday is flawed, considering the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has cut ties with its Russian counterpart since the war began. Many Ukrainian believers also started celebrating Christmas on December 25 in line with Europeans this year, as another means to distance themselves from their neighbors. After their talks, the Russian president said he was open to serious dialogue regarding Ukraine, but Kyiv has to accept new territorial realities going forward. While it may seem bizarre that Ukraine would opt not to have a break from the war, Kyiv's response to the ceasefire was less than enthusiastic. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said the ceasefire was only meant to be a cover for Russia to resupply and stop Ukrainian advances in the eastern Donbass region. UK Foreign Secretary James Cleverly said such a pause would do nothing to advance the prospects of peace. Similarly, German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock warned that the promise a ceasefire would not bring either freedom or security. Hours after Russia's announcement, Germany said it would follow the US and offer a Patriot air defense missile system to Kyiv along with Armu-Red vehicles. US President Joe Biden suggested that Putin was just trying to find oxygen through this proposal. Biden's claim that the Russian president is trying to buy time touches on the series of failures Russia has faced recently. Not only did Moscow lose hold of its Ukrainian land grabs from the early days of the war when Kyiv's successful counteroffensive swept through in the autumn, but missile strikes have started to reach deep inside Russia. Moscow has admitted that at least 89 Russians were killed on New Year's Eve, the most important date in the Russian calendar. The UK's Ministry of Defence also shone a light on some of the divisions within Russia at the moment in its latest update. The Luhansk People's Republic (LNR) and Donetsk People's Republic (DPR) were two of the four illegally annexed Ukrainian regions Russia claims now belongs to Moscow. Russia's former president lashed out at the US on Thursday in a statement calling for the country's warships, armed with hypersonic missiles, to be stationed close to Washington, D.C. Dmitry Medvedev, who serves as the deputy chair of Russia's Security Council, made the remarks in a vitriolic Telegram post in reaction to an appeal to ordinary Russians from the U.S. Embassy. Hypersonic missiles are exceptionally fast, and can travel on an unpredictable flight path, making them harder to intercept with traditional air defense systems. The Zircon has a range of between 310 and 620 miles, according to CNN, which cited the Missile Defense Advocacy Alliance. The 405-mile-long Potomac River passes through Washington, D.C., the seat of the U.S. federal government. On Wednesday, Russia announced that it was sending its Admiral Gorshkov warship, armed with Zircon hypersonic cruise missiles, on a long-range voyage that would pass through the Atlantic Ocean, Indian Ocean, and Mediterranean Sea. Medvedev has produced some of the most extreme and hawkish commentary since Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, repeatedly touting his country's nuclear arsenal and often going beyond the rhetoric offered by Putin. Calling the U.S. "sons of bitches" and "freaks" in his post on Thursday, he described the U.S. Embassy's tweet as a cynical effort to use Nazi propaganda methods, per Reuters translation. The U.S. has been one of Ukraine's most important allies during the conflict, sending billions of dollars of aid and weaponry to the country. Medvedev said that the sight of the Admiral Gorshkov off the coast of the U.S. would bring to their senses anyone who poses a direct threat to Russia and our allies, according to Reuters. That's according to U.S. think tank Institute for the Study of War, ISW, which commented on Putin's offer of a Christmas ceasefire in its January 5 report. ISW analysts noted that Ukrainian and Western officials, including U.S. President Joe Biden, immediately highlighted the hypocrisy of the ceasefire announcement and emphasized that Russian forces continued striking Ukrainian military and civilian infrastructure on December 25, when many Orthodox Ukrainians celebrate Christmas and New Year's. The ISW also pointed out that Putin could have been seeking to secure a 36-hour pause for Russian troops to afford them the ability to rest, recoup, and reorient to relaunch offensive operations in critical sectors of the front. Such a pause would disproportionately benefit Russian troops and begin to deprive Ukraine of the initiative. Putin cannot reasonably expect Ukraine to meet the terms of this suddenly declared ceasefire and may have called for the ceasefire to frame Ukraine as unaccommodating and unwilling to take the necessary steps towards negotiations. This is an intentional information tactic that Russia has previously employed, as ISW has reported. According to the analysts, ceasefires also take time to organize and implement. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov notably said on December 14 that Russia has no plans for a ceasefire for Russian Orthodox Christmas, so Putin's sudden January 5 announcement was surprising. The date of Russian Orthodox Christmas in 2023, after all, has been known for centuries. Had Putin been serious about a religiously motivated ceasefire, he had ample time to prepare for it. In addition, as mentioned by ISW experts, Putin's framing of the ceasefire on religious grounds additionally reinforces another twofold Russian information operation that frames Ukraine as suppressing religious groups and positions Putin as the true protector of the Christian faith. One Mill blogger who was previously embedded with Russian units in Bakhmut and attended the annexation ceremony at the Kremlin in September employed overtly genocidal, dehumanizing rhetoric in response to the ceasefire and stated that Russian soldiers do not want compromise. The ISW summed up that the use of a ceasefire as an information operation, coupled with Putin's continued propagation of maximalist goals in Ukraine, continues to indicate that Putin has no desire to actually negotiate with Ukraine. Skibitsky said it would take Russia about 2 months to assemble the military formations, and their battlefield effectiveness would depend on how well equipped and trained they are. He added that much will also hinge on the continued supply of Western ammunition and weapons to Ukraine. Ukraine's intelligence services expect a new wave of Russian mobilization to be announced on January 15. He added that the invaders are focusing on getting as many combat-ready troops as they can, while planning a new major offensive in Ukraine. On January 4, Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister Hanna Maliar said that amid large losses of personnel, Russia was preparing the second wave of the so-called partial mobilization in the first quarter of 2023. Earlier, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine reported that the next wave of mobilization in Russia was planned for January-February 2023. South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham on Thursday called on President Biden to send tanks to Ukraine, as requested by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The Republican lawmaker urged Biden to act following an announcement that France would send the first Western tanks to Ukraine to aid the fight against Russia's invasion. France will supply AMX-10 light tanks to Ukraine, an aide to French President Emmanuel Macron told reporters Thursday, according to French news agency AFP. Earlier this week, Zelensky renewed his calls for Western tanks to help his troops in areas like Donetsk where brutal ground warfare continues. President Biden on Wednesday said the U.S. is considering sending Bradley fighting vehicles to Ukraine, an armored vehicle that, while not technically a tank, is propelled on tracks and equipped with a free-turning turret. It has less firepower than a modern tank and shorter firing range. The Bradley vehicles are capable of transporting more infantrymen, arms and communications than tanks and can quickly and effectively maneuver on the battlefield. But it is unclear if Zelensky would view the lighter vehicles as sufficient for Ukraine's needs. The United States on Friday issued new sanctions targeting suppliers of Iranian drones that Washington said have been used to target civilian infrastructure in Ukraine during the conflict with Russia. Russia has been attacking vital Ukraine infrastructure since October with barrages of missile and drones, causing sweeping power blackouts as cold weather sets in. The U.S. Treasury Department said it imposed sanctions on 6 executives and board members of Iran's Quds Aviation Industries, QAA, also known as Light Airplanes Design and Manufacturing Industries. Iran has previously acknowledged sending drones to Russia but said they were sent before Russia's February invasion. Moscow has denied its forces used Iranian drones in Ukraine. Friday's sanctions reflect U.S. concerns about Iranian-Russian military cooperation and Russia's use of Iranian drones to hit Ukraine, a threat that could become more potent if Tehran were to provide missiles to Moscow to shore up Russian supplies. Among those designated was Syed Hojatullah Gorish, QAI's board chairman and senior official in Iran's Ministry of Defense and Armed Forces Logistics, who has led Iran's military research and development efforts and was responsible for negotiating Iran's agreement with Russia for the supply of Iranian drones for Russia's war in Ukraine, the Treasury said. The move freezes any U.S. assets of those designated and generally bars Americans from dealing with them. Those engaged in certain transactions with them also risked being hit by sanctions. A United Nations agency said in a report that Ukraine would need at least $1.79 billion to restore its telecommunications sector, destroyed or completely seized in some parts of the country by Russia, Reuters reported. The assessment by the UN International Telecommunication Union, ITU, was commissioned in April to determine the extent of destruction to Ukraine's communication networks since Russia's full-scale invasion began in February. The report found that communications infrastructure in 10 out of 24 Ukrainian oblasts had suffered considerable damage in the first 6 months of Russia's full-scale invasion. The report also says that Russia unilaterally switched Ukrainian dialing codes, which are fixed by the UN agency, to Russian ones, and that there had been 1,123 cyber attacks against Ukraine, according to the Reuters article. The report was published in late December and was not highly publicized. According to Reuters, Western diplomats privately expressed frustration concerning delays to the report's publication. In a letter seen by Reuters, in September, the EU wrote to then ITU Secretary-General Ho-Lin Zhao calling for the report's release. Zhao responded by saying that the assessment was still underway, Reuters reported. Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister Irina Vereshchuk urged people living on the territories occupied by Russia to abstain from attending church services and crowded places during the Orthodox Christmas celebrations. The Orthodox Christmas on January 7 remains the main celebration date for most believers, although Ukraine has made the Western Christmas on December 25 an official holiday as well. A Ukrainian OSINT group informed Napalm also reported getting tip-offs about supposed attacks in churches in occupied territories, meant to frame Ukraine as an aggressor and motivate potential conscripts in Russia to join the army. On January 5, Russian media reported that President Vladimir Putin ordered to implement a 36-hour ceasefire on January 6 to 7, on the occasion of the Orthodox Christmas. Ukraine and its allies have dismissed the report as a lie and an attempt to win time. In the early afternoon of January 6, during the supposed truce, the air raid alarms went off across Ukraine following a reported takeoff of missile-carrying jets in Belarus. Shortly before, the city of Kramatorsk in Donetsk Oblast was hit with 2 missiles. The city of Kherson was shelled in the morning of January 6, and at least 1 person was killed. The U.S. announced its largest Ukraine aid package yet, worth $3.75 billion, which includes Bradleys and other armored vehicles as well as $907 million in more financing for Ukraine and its neighbors to buy American-made weapons and equipment. The new U.S. military drawdown, worth about $2.85 billion and featuring 50 M2A2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles armed with anti-tank missiles, is aimed at getting as much to Ukrainian forces as possible during the winter months, before spring sets in and an expected increase in fighting begins. Pentagon officials say the provision of several hundred armored vehicles, along with plans for U.S. training of Ukrainian troops on combined arms as well as operations and maintenance of the Bradleys, offer Ukraine a chance to retake territory from Russia's invasion force. The vehicles are expected to help Ukraine's infantry accompany its fast-moving armored forces. The new aid, which draws from the Ukraine spending package Congress approved last month, includes $225 million for Ukraine and $682 million for European allies, under the U.S. Foreign Military Financing Program, to buy American-made military gear over the long term. Cooper said Ukraine would likely buy air defense weapons, artillery and armored vehicles, its top priorities. The latest military equipment drawn down from U.S. military stockpiles includes new types of projectiles, such as an undisclosed number of RIM-7C Sparrow missiles, which Ukraine can integrate into its Soviet-era Buk air defenses, and 4,127mm Zuni rockets, which can be mounted on Ukraine's fixed-wing or rotary-wing aircraft. With the Bradleys come more M113 armored personnel carriers, mine-resistant, ambush-protected vehicles, and Humvees. The U.S. is sending 155mm Paladin self-propelled howitzers for the first time, with more 105mm towed howitzers and related ammunition. The Bradley, a tracked vehicle made by BAE Systems, carries up to 10 troops and is usually armed with 2 TOW anti-tank missiles, a 25mm Bushmaster chain gun and a 7.62mm coaxial machine gun. With it, the U.S. is sending 500 TOW missiles and 250,000 rounds of 25mm ammunition. Germany and France also pledged to send infantry fighting vehicles from their arsenals, but the Allies stopped short of sending Western tanks, which are more complex for Ukraine's needs and have longer-range guns. The Bradley, used to transport troops to combat, is not a tank but is known as a tank killer because of the anti-tank missile it can fire. Cooper defended the pace in sending the armored vehicles and the United States' reluctance to send Abrams tanks. The new package, she said, became appropriate as Ukrainian forces have demonstrated a lot of growing proficiency in maintenance and sustainment on American and other systems, partially through using remote telemaintenance. While the US and the Netherlands are due to jointly send refurbished Czech T-72 tanks, the Abrams tank, in addition to being a gas guzzler, is quite challenging to maintain. U.S. President Joe Biden and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz confirmed in a joint statement Thursday that the U.S. would provide Bradleys to Ukraine while Germany would provide Marder infantry fighting vehicles. France earlier this week pledged to send AMX-10 RC vehicles, billed as light tanks, on wheels boasting armor-breaking 105mm guns. The Marder contingent entails up to 40 vehicles, or a battalion's worth, according to officials in Berlin. Deliveries of the vehicles to Ukraine, plus an 8-week training for Ukrainian troops in Germany, are to conclude by the end of March. German Defense Minister Christine Lambrecht and her U.S. counterpart, Lloyd Austin, spoke by phone Friday about details of their new contributions and to prepare the January 20 meeting of international donor countries known as the Ramstein format. Lambrecht described the Marder and Bradley pledges as a joint German-American initiative to ship Western-made combat vehicles to war-torn Ukraine, supporting France's contribution of what she described as wheeled reconnaissance tanks. The latest German military contribution also includes a Patriot air defense system, following the Americans' lead from December. Previous notable military contributions by Berlin include rocket launchers, howitzers, the Iris-T anti-missile weapon and the Gepard air defense tank, which is credited with shooting down Russian drones and missiles despite being deemed too old for service in the Bundeswehr. Russia's announced unilateral Christmas ceasefire is likely to be an information operation intended to damage Ukraine's reputation, says the Institute for the Study of War. Vladimir Putin instructed Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu to initiate a ceasefire from 12 o'clock January 6 to 2400 hours January 7 along the entire line of contact between parties in Ukraine. Ukrainian and Western officials immediately highlighted the hypocrisy of the ceasefire announcement and emphasized that Russian forces launched over 40 missiles at Ukrainian cities on December 25, when many Ukrainians celebrate Christmas. Ukraine rejects Vladimir Putin's truce to observe Orthodox Christmas. Kremlin ordered truce in Ukraine uncertain amid reports of continued attacks. Putin could have been seeking to secure a 36-hour pause for Russian troops too. This pause would disproportionately benefit Russian troops and begin to deprive Ukraine of the initiative. Ukrainian forces reportedly conducted a successful counterattack as Russian forces continued offensive operations around Bakhmut over the past few days. Russian sources refuted this report and claimed that Russian troops have advanced northeast and south of Bakhmut. Russia has built up its forces in Belarus and released footage of military drills along the border with Ukraine, stoking fears of a renewed assault on Kiev's defenses from the north. France 24's team on the ground met Ukrainian volunteers in the Zhytomyr region who are preparing to face another Russian attack. Russia has been increasing its forces in Belarus since last October, shifting units that were beaten back by Ukraine's counteroffensive in the east and south. The buildup has heightened fears that Moscow is planning to use Belarus as a launch pad for a fresh offensive, as it did at the start of the war in February 2022. This time, however, Ukraine's territorial defense forces say they are ready to face down any attack. Russia is preparing a new wave of mobilization in occupied Ukrainian territories, the Ukrainian military's National Resistance Center reported on January 6. In the occupied parts of Ukraine's eastern Donetsk Oblast, Russians are establishing the Russian Main Directorate for Traffic Safety of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, also known as GIBDD, and have taken over local Ukrainian authorities, according to the center. The center also said that in the Russian-occupied city of Horlivka in Donetsk Oblast, the Russian military is planning to mobilize 2,000 people and has increased patrols in the town to look for men of conscription age. To bolster its forces fighting near Severodonetsk in Ukraine's eastern Luhansk Oblast, Russia also stepped up mobilization in occupied parts of the oblast in early December, the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces said.